say that this is the first of a series of lectures we're calling the Egypt Salon. So we're thrilled here at the Middle East and Middle East American Center to be partnering with with our friends at the Alliance of Egyptians of North America in this effort to bring a series of interesting talks to the community and to the Graduate Center. So this is a very exciting enterprise, and we're thrilled that Professor Abulghar is here to launch this event. Other events that we're planning in the series, November 22nd, we'll have Sahar Aziz, Professor of Law at Rutgers University, and December 6th with Jennifer Deere, who's Associate Professor of History at UC Santa Barbara, and she's a historian of the environment, and we'll talk about the River Nile. So keep your eyes open for news of those events, and in the meantime, please enjoy this afternoon with us. And again, thank you for coming out in the pouring rain.
I'm going to start very quickly. First of all, we send you emails, so please make sure your email is included, maybe with me or Jeremy. Obviously, we can really contact you for future events. As Professor Beth mentioned, we're going to have 3 talks this semester. Next semester, we're planning for another maybe 3 similar talks. So we're going to keep that up. So I want to let you quickly about the website. This is the website. Actually, you can easily find out on Centennial, then ccny.cony.edu. So Centennial goes for the first event we had, Centennial of the 1919 Egyptian Revolution. That was a one-day conference. This is done. You will find a lot of video talks. All the videos are being put here, so that's a good reference. But then we started the series. So the series is here. If you click on it, you will. This is the monthly series, and again, where it's going to be held and all that. The series for this semester, 3 talks. Professor Beth Barron just mentioned those 3. So again, this is Professor Muhammad Abulghar, but then Sahar Aziz and John Deere will be we try to make it on Friday around 5 o'clock, 4:30. That's the time we're trying to target. All right, so again, here are the speakers. If you notice, if you click on abstract and presentation, you will find everything about the speaker. And basically, his bio, Professor Abulghar, and then abstract of his talk. And then once the talk is finished, we're going to post his presentation, and also the video hopefully will be able to upload it to this site. So again, if you haven't done it, please put your name, email, so you are on the list, and we can keep in touch with you. All right, Professor Abulghar. Let me introduce you, I guess, first. Professor Muhammad Abulghar, maybe he was a speaker, by the way, in the conference I mentioned. But so many of us know him as a result of this. But basically, he's a professor of medicine. That's like professor of medicine in Cairo University. He's the co-founder and clinical director of the first IVF center in Egypt. And he's known, really. He's one of the leading people in Egypt and internationally. He's the editor-in-chief of the Middle East Fertility Society Journal, which is a peer-reviewed scientific journal covering the field of human reproduction and fertility. That's a CV. He gave it to us. It is on the website. But honestly, Abulghar has a lot of other activities. Political activities. We know he's an activist, but also he had a book. Oh, by the way, this is Professor Beth Barron. I borrowed that from you. This is his Professor Abulghar book about arts. Literally, very, very, really, honestly, very good reference, a great book. He has other books about 1919 Egyptian Revolution. So he has a lot of things. I don't want to make it too long. Professor Abulghar, welcome.
Professor.
Yeah. I do it.
Professor and Professor Saadawi I would like to thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm very happy to be here today. My talk today will be documenting the evolution of the Jewish life in Egypt during the 20th century. As we all know, the history of Jews in Egypt dates back long time before that, but I'm mainly going to concentrate on the 20th century. I published the book 2004 about the Egyptian Jews, which was printed 17 editions in Egypt by Dar el-Hilal, and it was very, very well circulated and read. And now I am in the final stage of making a new book about the Egyptian Jews, which hopefully will be published in January. Will be published in the January or February. Jews lived in Egypt for several centuries before Christ, and the real documentation is only for a little bit more than 600 before Christ in the Elephantine Island, where there are antiquities discovered and real documentation. Before that, it is only in Torah and in biblical books, but no historical documentation about the Jewish life in Egypt before that date. In the 15th century, there was a massive immigration from Spain to the whole Middle East, the whole Mediterranean area, and Egypt was part of that. In the 19th century, they moved to Egypt from different parts of the Ottoman Empire, and then a small minority from the Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe came to Egypt in the early 20th century. Egyptian Jews are from different and various ethnic, cultural, economic, and social backgrounds. They spoke many languages, different languages at different stages of their history in Egypt. Some of the languages vanished, almost vanished, like the Ladino and some other languages they used to speak. That's why generalization is impossible if you want to talk about Egyptian Jews, because they are not really one thing you can talk about. But just for sake of dividing the life of the Jews in Egypt, I divided them into three phases. The first phase from the turn of the century till 1935-37. The second phase, and that was the golden period of the Jews in Egypt. And then the second period, which I called it the period of prosperity. They had a great life in Egypt during this period, but worry and problems started during this period, and it came to an end with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And then the critical period, which was followed by dispersion from 1948 till 1967. Afterwards, the number of the Jews in Egypt became very, very small, and they are dwindling. And the Jews left in Egypt now are very, very few. Most of them are very old. The youngest is the head of the Jewish Egyptian Jews, Magda Haoun, which is a close friend, and she's a relatively young lady. If you look at the official census of Egypt during the period I'm talking about, the population of Egypt was around 10 million at the turn of the century, and in 1947 it was almost a little less than 20 million, and the number of Jews varied from 25,000 till the highest number, 65,000. This is the official census, which is not really very correct, because according to other historians, like in the memorial collection here, which thanks to Dr. Pett, I had a copy of it. They said that the figures are quite similar to the official consensus, and Maurice Farragon also, in his report of the number of Jews, gave a similar number. But Jewel Benin, his very good study, reported much higher number, 75,000, and Jacques Hassoun even went higher up to 90,000 Jews in 47. I think the number is something in the middle, because the reporting was not very good. And many of the Jews didn't have Egyptian nationality, so the papers were mixed up. So I would say that the highest number would be around 75,000 as reported by Joel. And during the golden period, actually the Egyptian Jews did very, very well economically, in business, and in the prosperity of Egypt, and enormous value for the economy during this period in industry, agriculture. They built Helwan Railway, the Delta Railway, Kena and Aswan Railway, the first public transportation system in Egypt by Sawaris buses, and lots of industrial companies sold, and different bankings, like the agriculture bank, the sugar refinery in Komombo area, textile, the big stores downtown, Sikorel, Shemla, all these big stores, and then also development of areas in Maadi, in Alexandria and Smuha. These are all very big projects, and there were prominent families from the Jewish, Egyptian Jews, the Sikorel, Sawaris, Abtawi, Taban, that was the most prominent name, because they were also involved in political life and the parliament as ministers, etc., not only in business. Menasha, Musiri, they had a bank, Musiri, and the daughter of Musiri is sitting with us here in the room, and the Rolo family, the Adda family, Pichotto family from Alexandria, Harari family, and Samoha family again from Alexandria. A large sector of the community were well educated, cultured, and wealthy. They spoke 3 to 6 languages, and they had great life in Egypt during all their stay till the very last years before of dispersion. The Jews were very, very small in number compared to the population of Egypt, less than 0.5% of the population, but they had 1/3 of all shareholding companies registered in Egypt. That is, it shows how important their role in the economy of Egypt, and they continue to reinvest their money locally in Egypt till the 40s. When they start to get worried, then the rich families sold many of their investment in Egypt and left the country at different phases afterwards, as we will see. A large section of the Jews also belonged, not all of them were very rich, those families. There was a big middle class group of the Jews in Egypt who were working in industry, in bankings, in lots of companies, and they had also very good and comfortable life in Egypt, and they had a good education. But we should not forget Yahud al-Hara, the Jews of the Harat al-Yahud. They were poor, less educated, and they had lots of problems all through. During the golden period, it's very well documented that religious freedom was 100%, was complete. I mean, they had all the facilities, all the possibilities to do all their religious activities. I thought, according to my research, there was 55 synagogues in Egypt, but I found out that lately, after I written it, that there were 59 synagogues, and they had something which is very special to Egypt, which is having private synagogues. I mean, rich people in their garden, they have their own synagogues like the family, They have their own synagogue in the family, and they were present. The synagogues were in Cairo, Alexandria, in Delta, in Mahal al-Kubra. There is a famous and old important synagogue in other parts of Delta, and political involvement of the Jews in Egypt was present, but very, very early. But the time advanced a little bit. The majority of the Egyptian Jews concentrated on the business and left completely the political life. Probably the most important figure, very early figure of the Egyptian Jews is Yaqub Samnoah. Yaqub Samnoah is a great Egyptian. Yaqub Samnoah, he is the founder of the Egyptian theater. He translated some French plays, and he had in Azbakiyah the first performance in Egypt in the 19th century, in 1860, 1870. And then he wrote lots of one or two acts plays. And he was also a very good journalist. And he had a big fight with Khedive Ismail, so he was kicked out of the country, not because he's a Jew, because of his political opposition of the Khedive. He went to France and started publishing his own paper attacking the Khedive Ismail and supporting Arabi during the 18th. And he had good relations with Arabi during 1981 fight at that time. His famous journal written in Arabic with lots of caricatures. It's called Abu Nadara. Probably some people heard about Abu Nadara. It was republished in Beirut last year, the whole edition. Very, very interesting in Arabic. Then, again, the Jews of Alexandria supported Arabi national revolution. Yusuf Aslan Qattawi was elected as a member of the parliament from Komombo, and later in the Senate, Majlis al-Shuyukh, and he became the Minister of Finance of Egypt, and later he became the Minister of Communications. Leon Castro was working with Saad Zaghloul for a long time. He went with him to Paris to negotiate the outcome of Egyptian of 1919 revolution and Egypt independence, etc. And Zaghloul, he couldn't speak English. He spoke French only. So Leon Castro was his translator and sort of a private secretary for him. And he was the head of the Zionist organization, general secretary of the Zionist organization in Egypt. And at that time, there was no problem at all. I mean, there was no conflict being a Zionist and being an Egyptian at these very early stages. But things changed later on. In 1919 revolution, the Copts and the Muslims and the Jews were all involved together in the revolution. It was a real Egyptian revolution, and religion was not a part of it at all. And some of the Jews, of course, we know many of the Copts. The Copts in particular had a very big impact in 1919 revolution, and I spoke about that in length by names in the last talk. But Daoud Hazan, Leon Castro, Ben Kazin from Tanta joined the Wafd Party, which is a liberal popular party representing the whole Egyptians, and they were very active in the revolution. The first constitution of Egypt, which was written in 1923, there were 30 members. One of them was a Jew, Yusuf Aslan Qattawi, and they also had a very good relation with the other minority parties, Ahrar Dusturiyin, the more right-wing parties on the right of the Liberal Party, and many of them were involved in the Egyptian communist movement also. They also participated in the social work and different NGOs, and many of them were active in sports. And in 1950, there were two players, Jewish Egyptian players in the Egyptian team, which lost in the semi-final of the World Cup by 1 point to the United States, and they came third on the world at that time. Sikorel represented Egypt in Amsterdam Olympic Games in fencing. He didn't get a medal, but he represented Egypt at that time. They also had a very close relation to the royal family. King Fuad in particular, and to the Sheikh al-Azhar and the Pope of the Copts. Also they had good relation with them. Rich, middle class and poor Jews lived homogeneously with their corresponding sectors among Egyptians. They were separated from each other. The Egyptian Jews were not one community. Rich people lived together, middle class together, and poor together, like the rest of the Egyptians. And they spoke the language. So the elite Jews, they spoke French. That was the main language, was French. Like the upper class, al-Bashawat, at that time of Egypt, the same. And the middle class and the poor, they spoke Arabic, plus the middle class spoke usually French and maybe more languages also. Now, from 1935, 37 problems started. And started with related to the problems which happened to Palestine at that period, and the fights between the Palestinians and the Jews, and lots of demonstrations and massacres and that was reflected on the Egyptian scene. Before that period, not one politician in Egypt ever thought of the Zionism or religion or Palestinian problem or danger of creating Israel, or that was not in the mind of anybody. And some of the very important politicians, like Saad Zaghloul, for example, when he was asked about the role of Egypt, I mean, he said, our role is to keep Egypt. Our history is pharaonic history, and if we want an extension, it should be Sudan. When the Arabs develop, we can start to think of that, but this is not our problem now. He didn't have in mind at all he doesn't want to involve Egypt in the problems of Arab. And Mustafa Nahas in the beginning was like this, but later on, and he was against Arab League, Saad Zaghloul. When the idea came, he said, this is nonsense. But by time, of course, things it changed from around 1930. During this period, the Jews continued to flourish in business, and during the Second World War, they did very, very good business. Again, education in general, and that is a very big thing, education of the Jews in Egypt, which I have a big chapter written about it. Because really they did a big effort to educate the poor ones, and they were successful to a great extent. Social and psychological slow changes resulted in gradual separation between the identity of the Jews and the rest of the Egyptians, which applied mainly on the rich and educated Jews. Gradually, they started to be separated from the rest of the community, and one of the things which showed this is the loss of the Arabic language. The gradual decline of the Arabic language among the upper and middle class of the Jewish population, which gradually started, they became sort of Khawagat, because they couldn't speak the language. So the grandfather used to speak very good Arabic in his business, and also spoke Arabic at home. The children, they knew other languages, but Arabic was the main language. Next generation, the father was still working with Arabic with his people, but at home they never speak this. It was Italian at the end of the 19th century, turned to French afterwards, and the very elite, they could speak English also, because they went to some English schools there. And the third generation, none of them spoke Arabic at all. They couldn't speak Arabic, broken Arabic, just to buy things from a shop or do this. And this resulted in sort of dissociation of the Jews from the rest of the community. Barada, she published her PhD study in Sydney about the Egyptian Jewish immigration to Australia over a period of around 20 years. And that was a very good study because there was an oral discussion and questionnaire with all the Egyptian Jews who left there. And she found out that only 35% of them spoke good Arabic who went to Australia. 65% they had moderate or poor Arabic, and the younger people didn't speak at all, very little. The older they spoke a better Arabic language. And this is a Jewish community papers, and it will all written in French. I mean, the board of the Jewish elected from all the people, and the Jewish vote from Al-Hara, from the poor Jews, was very influential because they supported Qattawi against your family. And still, the minutes of all the Jewish files was in French, very, very little in Arabic, and practically none in Hebrew. So Arabic was not a priority at all. The decline of the importance of Arabic may be related to, because the business became international, mainly with Europe, so it was not important for business anymore. Maybe they wanted closer relation culturally with Europe. That is possible. But that didn't only affect the Jews. Actually, it affected the elite Egyptians, some of the pashas or very rich Egyptians. Also, they were speaking French at home, and their Arabic was very poor, but it was very clear among the Jews. Again, there was a change in the mood and the feelings towards the big power. All Egyptians, Muslims, Copts, Jews, they were against the British in the very early, because Britain was the occupier of Egypt and the power suppressing Egypt. So in the very early 20th century and during 1919 revolution, that was clear. Afterwards, the Jews started to feel insecure, particularly after 1936 signature of the treaty with Mustafa Nahas of independence of Egypt, and that the British army will leave only to the Suez Canal area for later to leave Egypt completely. So some of them started to be a little bit, they felt safer in the presence of the British. That's why the feeling started. During the Second World War, or the period of the rise of the Nazi, it was very clear that the Wafd party, the big liberal party representing Egypt, was clearly against the Nazi, very clear, supported by the majority of Egyptians. And of course all the Jews were in the same thing. But there were rising new parties, Muslim Brothers and Masr al-Fatah, which was a very small, noisy party, nationalist party, sort of a fascistic party. Mussolini was his big symbol. They were making a big noise, but very little actual influence. But the rest of the Egyptians, the poor farmer, the people in the countryside, they were really they didn't have a proper idea about anything. I mean, they were not with or against anybody, only the politicized people. When we come to the Egyptian Jews and culture, Yaqub Sannour, which I mentioned in the beginning, is a very, very important figure, lasting till today. Murad Farag was a very good writer in Arabic. He wrote a huge number of books, and he was a lawyer also. He was a lawyer of the King Fuad, and he wrote lots of poems, and when the language started to be deteriorated, the influence of Jews on the culture gradually declined. However, in certain areas, the Karit Jews in Egypt, القرائين, اليهود القرائين, had a very strong impact on culture. Dawood Hosni, he is a great composer. He was the first one to compose an opera in Arabic, and lots of songs which are we hear till today in Cairo, all over, you know. And he died in 1937. Laila Morad is a great singer and movie star. We all loved her and we know about her. Togo Mizrahi was the first one to make a complete film. There is one before him from Tanta who started the film industry, but he was the one who started really to make in Alexandria and then moved to Egypt films. And then there are several movie stars, Ra'ya Bahir, Camellia, etc. After the 67 war, publications written by Israeli Egyptians, as well as publications by Egyptians, non-Jewish Egyptians in Egypt, supported the idea that all Egyptian Jews were Zionists. Both of them, the Egyptian Jews who immigrated to Israel, the writings during that period was saying practically that every Jew in Egypt was, and that was not true. And again, the Egyptian writers, they said that every Jew is so and so and so. I mean, very bad books written about the Jews during this period, and all has nothing to do with history, actually. Actually, it was a political things at that time. The narrative corresponds with that of many Egyptian writers who supported the ideas that Egyptian Jews was more Zionist than Egyptian. And this narrative was challenged and completely changed after the peace treaty. The many Egyptian Jews who left to Israel, they started to speak out very nicely about Egypt, and several books were written that their life in Egypt was good and they didn't have a bad time, etc. Mostly, of course, some of them had difficult times at certain periods, but the language changed on both sides after the peace treaty. And the writings published in Israel, Jacqueline Kahanoff, I don't know if you have read her book, of course, The Ladder, published in 1951. They were original Egyptian, confirms the official Zionist account is entirely false. And truly, the Egyptian Jews and the elite Egyptian Jews, right from the very, very beginning, they were against Zionism and against the creation of the State of Israel. Because they knew and realized very, very early that creation of Israel means that the Egyptian Jewish society is going to disappear. It was, for them, it was very, very clear. And when Haim Weizmann visited Egypt in the turn of the century, he wanted to get donations to start some areas in Palestine and some groups there to invest in that. They absolutely refused to pay him anything. The only one who paid him was Sheikh al-Azhar, 100 pounds, because he felt that they convinced him that those are very poor Jews from Eastern Europe and from different areas, and they are having a bad time, so why not help them? And Egypt, they have a nice life, they don't have any problem, and so on. The Karid Jews, اليهود القرائين, دول ناس جمال جدا. They were minority, 10%. The only difference between the Karit and the Rabbaniyit is that they only believe in Torah. But the rest of the Jews Rabbanim, most of them, they believe in Torah and Talmud. They're like in Islam القرآن والحديث. هم يؤمنوا بس بالتوراة فقط, only in Torah. And they were the ones who spoke very good Arabic. They were dressed like Egyptians, working in different professions, etc. They were the less educated in general. They were not as rich as the other group of Jews. Ashkenazi Jews in Egypt was a real minority. It was very, very small, and they were mostly professionals, came with a very good education from Eastern Europe, but the majority was the Sephardim Jews. That is the majority. They were the leaders of the whole community. Then we come very fast. أنا مش عارف الوقت الساعة كم, أنا خايف يكون وقت. There was a shock after 1948 when it was discovered that the majority of the Egyptian Jews, they do not have Egyptian nationality. Although many of them were born in Egypt, their parents were born in Egypt, and grandparents were born in Egypt. So that was a big question mark with different possible explanations. One say is, which I don't agree with, as I'll tell you, is that the Egyptian government, they didn't want the Egyptian Jews to take the Egyptian nation, or they were making obstacles for them to have the Egyptian nationality. If we go to different studies showed that only 30%, around 30% of the Egyptians, they have Egyptian nationality. And Rachel Barda study in Australia showed that 45% of the Egyptian Jews, they had foreign passports, European passports, and 33% without a nationality, and only 22% had Egyptian nationality. Was it difficult for Jesus to get Egyptian nationality? Actually, yes and no. Egypt was a part of the Ottoman Empire till 1914. And any Egyptian who would like to have a passport, it was very few people, because people were not really moving with passports at that time. But if you want to have a passport, your passport was called Osmanli. It's Osman, and written down Egypt. Osmanli Tunis, Osmanli Lebanon, and so on. When, after the First World War, when Turkey was defeated and the Ottoman Empire was finished, then Egypt became a new country. And at that time, anybody living in Egypt would automatically, if he asked for a passport, will get an Egyptian passport, irrespective of his religion, of his background, of his race, of anything. And that continued till 1929, when the first law for nationality was there. And that law, by all means, I mean, Shamir, who was the ambassador, Israeli ambassador in Cairo, and before that he was the academic center in Cairo, Israeli academic center director, he wrote clearly that this law was a very liberal law. And anybody living in Egypt can very easily get the Egyptian nationality. In the mid-40s, it became very difficult. When the law didn't change, the law was a liberal law, but the bureaucracy and the employees, because they didn't like the Jews to have the Egyptian nationality, because at that time there was a big problems in Palestine between the Israelis and Jews and the Palestinians. So there were many obstacles by local employees, but rich Jews or people could bribe somebody, they could get it, but with more difficulty. Why they didn't apply? If all these years they were allowed. The most important thing that many of the Jews, they always wanted to have a European passport if possible. And many of them, they already either bought in nationality, mostly Italians, because Italians were bribed like hell, giving the passports to Egyptian Jews, and French a little less, but the British was very difficult to get British passport all the time. At that time there was a law from the Ottoman period which the British insisted to continue, اللي هو قانون الامتيازات الأجنبية, that foreigners in Egypt, if you are a foreigner in Egypt, and if you don't have a nationality, you are not Egyptian, you are exempted from taxes, number one. Number two, you are not tried in front of the normal courts and the normal police. So if French or an Italian or any nation, or somebody with no nationality committed any crime, he will be tried in front of his counsel. So, and then in business-wise, it was better not to pay taxes. So it was an advantage if you are not getting a French or Italian or nationality. So might be better to be without nationality. You will have some advantage, some economic advantage. But some of it, like the people in the Harat al-Yahud, for example, they were very poor. They were not going to pay any taxes because they didn't have money anyway. It was ignorance and negligence. That is the United Nations report. It said that the main reason why the poor people didn't get, because of ignorance and negligence, and because it costed £5. And that was considered a lot of money for the poor people, which is £5 now is 20 cents or something like that. There are factors which affected negatively the life of the Egyptian Jews in Egypt. Demonstrations which started in Egypt in 35, 36, supporting the Palestinians. Some Egyptian politicians started to change their position, like Aluba Basha, who was the first one to start, and Makram Abed. They were the first two to start this. And then the Muslim Brotherhood became active. Masr al-Fatah again was, and then they started to be violent also, and they assassinated 2 prime ministers and 1 minister, and they burned a synagogue downtown, and they bombed Harat al-Yahud, the Jewish quarter. So all this affected negatively the life of the Jews in Egypt. And after the signing of the Anglo-Egyptian treaty, they were more worried because Britain will not anymore control Egypt in a very short time. And in 1937, Nahas Basha in Montreux, in Switzerland, signed with Britain the agreement that this law for foreigners, privileges for foreigners, is going to finish gradually within a period of 12 years. So by 1994, it was completely finished, but gradually started by the different, cancelling some courts and so on. And Rashi Basha, the prime minister in 1947, made a very important law which affected the Jews very much, which is a new law for the workers. And this new law, it has nothing to do actually with the Jews, but that new law made that 50% of board members of all shareholders, shareholding companies for Boursa, must be Egyptians. And 75% of employees must be Egyptians, and 90% of simple workers in any company or factory must be Egyptians. And because the Jews either didn't have a nationality, or they had a foreign nationality, so they are going to lose their jobs because they were not Egyptians like the other people who had other. So that law affected them very much. And also the law says that 40% of the total salaries should go to the Egyptian employees of the whole project. And then the serious period of gradual deterioration of the condition of the Jews from Egypt the creation of the State of Israel and the war, the first war, Israeli war, Arab war, Zionist activities were accepted. Saad Zaghlul's secretary was the secretary of the Zionist organization. So that was very well accepted in the first period. And then in the second period, it was not very accepted but not prevented. But in the third period, in that period, it became illegal to have any Zionist activities, and you could be imprisoned for that, and followed by bombing again of the Jewish quarters. After 6 months after the first war, life started to be normalized in Egypt, and many of the Jews who thought of leaving the Egypt calmed down, and things calmed down. Business started to work a little bit, and the Muslim Brothers were banned after they assassinated the Rashi Pasha. So that also helped to keep things more peaceful. In 51-52, the Mustafa Nahas cancelled the treaty with the British, and they started a big fight against the British army in Suez Canal, which ended by the burning of Cairo in 1952, and the whole mess, which things were a little bit difficult for everybody. In 52, the Egyptian military change occurred, coup or revolution or whatever you want to call it, and in the beginning they assured the Jews that things will be okay, and Muhammad Naguib visited the synagogue in Adli and met Al-Hakam al-Akbar, the big rabbi in Egypt, assured him that things will be okay. But in 54, the Lavon affair or Susanna case was happened, and that had a very, very, very important negative aspect on the Egyptian people, more than the government. Because the Mossad at that time, Gamal Abdel Nasser, in the very beginning, started to have some good relations with the United States. And in Israel, they thought that this may be dangerous. They don't want Egypt and the United States to be close. So it came to the mind of Lavon, who was at that time the Minister of Defense in Israel, that with the Mossad, they started bombing American things in Egypt, in Cairo and Alexandria, and they succeeded indeed in doing that until they were caught in Alexandria in front of Senametu, كانوا بيحرروا Senametu. والضابط اللي مسكهم ممدوح سالم اللي بقى رئيس الوزراء بعدين كان ساعتها مش نقيب ولا ما اعرفش ايه. Anyway, this incident in this group who made these two, the people were coming from Israel, few, and some from Egypt. And two from Egypt, one was a good surgeon, good doctor, from the Israeli hospital in Cairo, and another engineer from Alexandria. And both had a death penalty. Those, the only two had a death penalty because of this espionage. And that was highly publicized among the people. And people were very angry, not because the Mossad came, because the local Egyptian Jews were involved in this. And Lavon had to resign from his post as a Minister of Defense because of this big scandal in Israel, and it was followed by major changes. And then the 56 war, which affected everybody when France and Britain and then Israel joined, followed by the Suez Canal crisis. And there was a massive propaganda at that time which frightened most of the Jews in Egypt from continuing living under normal conditions. They nationalized the British and the French. And some of them were Jews, but there was nothing against the Jews, as a religion at that time. But there was a high degree of panic among the Jews from what was happening all over, and the propaganda, and finally, this led to the major exodus of Jewish exodus in 1956 and 57. They were not kicked out, but they were really frightened. So they had to leave. And when they had to leave, the government said that any Jew living in Egypt, not holding an Egyptian passport, he will lose his residency. He must sign a paper that he is going to lose his residency. And if he is an Egyptian, he will leave his nationality. And that made it very difficult for many of the Jews. Either you leave your nationality or not. And the result was the exodus of the majority of the Egyptians. After that, situation became very, very difficult for the people who left. And it was, if you read the bibliographies and people who were Jewish who written their life during this period, it was really very, very difficult and very bad. In the 60s in Egypt, there were not many people, but they had a difficult time, especially the young people. Transformation of Egypt into a modern nation state increasingly destabilized the foundation of the Jewish life. The Jews of Egypt had to respond to the dilemmas introduced by modernity, with colonism, liberalism, nationalism, secularism, Arabism, Islamism, communism, and Zionism. They have to make a position in all these major dilemmas, and that made it very, very difficult for them to continue with this modernization. All these ideologies were pulling the fabric of the society in conflicting directions. They had the challenges to their national identity, political forces that eventually forced them to exile. Now I have to give tribute to 5 great Egyptian Jews. The first is Yaqub Samnour, who really did great, introduced modern journalism in Egypt in the 19th century, and introduced theater, and his writings are really very nice still today, and they are funny and very nice writings. Murad Farag, who had a very nice poems, and he was doing a lot of things. Shahada Haroun, who is the father of the Jewish Egyptian leader Magda. He's the father of Magda Haroun, and he belonged to the Egyptian Communist Party, but he was a real good Egyptian, and he was a very dogmatic Jew also. I mean, he was very strongly kept his religion, but he was very, very much Egyptian, supporting Egypt all the time. And then Youssef Darwish is a lawyer, and I knew him very well. He died at the age of 99 in the beginning of the 21st century, and I used to visit him at home in Bab el-Louq. Very, very nice man. He was a lawyer, and he was imprisoned several times, again because of his political ideas. He was not a Zionist. But because of he was opposing the different forms of regimes. Albert Ayer, who is still alive, he is 92, very good friend of mine, very, very nice man, and he knows the history. He can give you lots of nice talks. And now there are some great Egyptians who didn't stay in Egypt, who left Egypt, and you know them better than me, these two. Edmond Japet, he was a man of literature and art, and he was a leader of a society in Egypt, of a big community writing in French, art and fan al-hadith, and lots of things. And suddenly, after 56, he found himself, he had to leave the country and to go to France, and there he became a major figure in French intellectual letter. He wrote many important books, among them the famous book, The Book of Questions. Japet mentioned Egypt hundreds of times in his writings. I quote Japet, "I have always found myself without a place, without a sense of belonging, but the image of a place for me is the image of Egypt." And Jacques Hassoun left Egypt, not because he's a Jew, but because he was a communist, young communist. He left Egypt at the age of 16. His father was مفتش قطر قطر الدلتا يعني الغلبان ده. He was an inspector in a very simple train in Delta, living in a small village close to محل الكوبا. But he was educated in Alexandria, and he joined the Egyptian Communist Party. He was arrested, and he was advised to leave Egypt. He became one of the most famous psychiatrists and psychoanalysts in France. And I think he is one of you, yani she is probably his student. And she came to Egypt with a group organized by Jacques Hassoun later after the peace treaty. And she wrote a book in French. And Hassoun is really, she talked a lot about him in that book. He says, I am Jewish because I am Egyptian, and I am Egyptian because I am Jewish. Now I quote two of the people present here, Carole Nagar, Egyptian born, French educated, lived in France, and then came to America. Carole Nagar has written, the water, the Nile, and the blood of her ancestors and their skin took on color of the sand for 2,500 years. Her ancestors were tied to Egypt by all the fibers of their beings. Carole dedicated her book to Jacques Hassoun memory. Actually, she came to Basatine to inspect the area where the barrier areas of the Jews and to find out how to save things. And she wrote her book in French. Unfortunately, my granddaughter is helping me to read it. And the final slide is from Jane Nagar, Sipping from the Nile. She published her book here in America, Sipping from the Nile. Jane Nagar, from her father's side, she comes from Musiri family, the biggest bank owners in Egypt. From her mother's side, Samouha family from Alexandria, the famous Samouha family. History, our family, she wrote in the book History, our family and Egypt alike, it changed irrecoverably that dazzling summer day as I stood on the stone terrace outside my bedroom and watched the world of my childhood ripple away, drowning in the heavy grey waters of the Nile. Like a submerged Atlantis, it would be shimmer faintly under the swell of life, invisible, untouchable, lost. And thank you very much.
So we'll take questions?
Yes, questions?
Let's come.
Would you like me to moderate? So, questions, yes, please.
I thank Dr. Muhammad very much because you are a great historian and this is a great lecture. I'll give you one example. When I was in medical school in Alexandria from 1952 to 1959, I have a lot of Jewish students. And even at the end of our baccalaureate, one of the Jewish girls, she married to a Muslim colleague. And the relation between all of us, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, was great. We never had any problem. And it almost like when one of them is very good in medicine, we used to, like talk to him in a very nice way. And I think like in Egypt in the 50s, and I think in the 60s also, the relation was excellent between the three religions in Egypt. And especially when we were in medical school, between the Jewish and the Muslim and the Christian.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, the Jews lived in Egypt during the golden period. Even the second period, they had a very nice life. And even all of them, they had a nice life. The problems actually started, the real problems in the 40s, By the end of the Second World War, then real problems started.
Yeah, yeah.
I Actually, I have a couple of questions,
Okay.
if I can start. One is that, I know one looks at Iraq and the Jewish community, the Jewish community and other minorities had a large role in the Communist Party. Can you say more about Jews in
Yes.
the Communist Party? Because I think,
Yes.
I mean, from Bienen's book and others, one gets the sense that they had a very large presence. Yes.
The first Communist Party started in Egypt 1897, very, very early, by a Russian Jew coming to Egypt and started the first Communist Party, which was a small party and mostly foreigners. And then some Egyptians, Egyptian Muslims and Copts joined and decided that anybody joining the Communist Party should be an Egyptian, not a Khawarija. So an Egyptian Jew is accepted, but not a Russian Jew. I mean, Egyptian Jew born in Egypt or has a tradition in Egypt. And the government was very, very much against this, and the British were very much against this in the turn of the century. So actually that was dissolved. The second wave of the Communist Party started in between the two wars, in between the First and the Second World War, in the 20s and the 30s, and a very big number, percentage of the Communist Party were Copts and Jews. Relatively, Muslims were more, of course, number-wise, but percentage-wise, related to the percent, was high. And this is a trend always. Minorities anyway try to join something idealistic or something different which can lead to progress. The Egyptian government attitude towards communism was very harsh, very, very difficult. They all had very long years of imprisonment and difficulties. And when they were imprisoned together, Zionists in the 40s and the communist Jews, the communists had a very bad treatment in prison and long time, and the Zionists very mild and very good treatment, and they were left out very fast. So it was not a big problem for the government to be. It was not a problem that you are a Jew. It could be at a certain stage a minor problem that you are a Zionist, but being a communist, it is a big catastrophe.
Maybe you can tell us about the current situation. You mentioned Magda Harun, of course, she's, and very few Jews in Egypt living there right now. What is the situation and how do you see the future? Or there is a chance more Jews, Egyptian Jews will come back, or how do you see that situation?
No, first of all, the community is very small. It's not politically involved in any direction. So there is no problem between the very small Jewish community, which are mostly elderly women, and the government right now. So, and even the public in general, they don't mind. I mean, every year I'm invited to the راس السنة يعني اليهودية the اسمها ايه Rosh Hashanah. And I go there every year. I see more Egyptians. I mean, 10 years ago when I went, there were only 20 people, 30 people. Now when I go, I find 200 or 300 people, and the police is outside protecting people. And they were scared that something will happen, and so they are very careful. So there is no problem with the Jews, between the few Jews and the government. And I think the most important thing for the Egyptian government and for the world community and for the Jews abroad is to help the heritage of the Jews in Egypt to be kept. That most of the synagogues, and some of them are historical synagogues, and very great, they should be restored. It will never really function because there are no people, Jewish people to, but they should be important historical sites. The Ben Ezra was restored ابن ميمون ميمونيدس was restored, and عدلي يعني اللي هو الأساسي إسماعيلية is in a reasonable condition. Generally is in a reasonable condition. But the Basatin, they need a lot of money. So they need support, world support, to keep the heritage, and that is the most important thing Magda Haroun is doing now.
You mentioned Ibn Maymun. Is he buried there? I thought all the time he's
No, he was born in North Africa, in Morocco,
Yeah.
and he came to Egypt when he was 30, and he lived all his life in Egypt. He wrote all his important books in Egypt. He was buried in Egypt, and there is a synagogue in his name where he is buried in Gamaleya near سيدنا الحسين في الحتة دي كده يعني حارة جوه حارة يعني. It's not a big synagogue, it's a small synagogue.
There is now a major,
Okay.
there
Yes.
is a major project to restore the Basatin area of the Jewish cemetery underway now.
I hope, but they were talking about this 20 years
So I
ago,
think it will
but
be-
nothing really happened.
I think
And
it's just about to start by the American Research Center in Egypt.
but did they have the funding?
They have
That is the
funding-
most important
they
thing,
have
you
the
know.
funding from some of the European embassies.
Well, I hope this.
I hope it will go through.
Yeah, I hope he is a great Egyptologist, and he is taking care of a very important temple in Sohag, and he has a PhD in Egyptology and is living in America for many years, PhD from here. But he is excavating every winter in Sohag, and he has lots of important publications. Sameh Iskandar is an important name in this area. Yes.
You mentioned Layla Murad. I've always found it interesting how she was, in 1953, she was chosen over Kulthum to become the official singer of the Egyptian Revolution. But in 1956, she was more or less forced to retire at the age of 38. I'm just wondering if this has to do with the tripartite aggression, or it has to do with something totally
No, didn't. Layla Murad retired because she was married to one of the few officers, and it was for social things, not for political things at all. She was married to Agih Abaza. He was second line of officers, army officers, and he was very influential. And she had a son from him. لا Anwar Wagdi before. Anwar Wagdi in the 40s. Anwar Wagdi, she was married in the 40s, but that was after 52. 54, she was married to Agih Abaza, who was a prominent officer, and he told her, you should stop filming and going. So that's the reason, but not a political reason.
I have
Sure.
one question, since you mentioned Ibn Mamoun and doctors, Egyptian doctors and so on. I was wondering to what extent, and you yourself have a background in medicine, to what extent the medical practice was segregated or not segregated. These Jewish doctors were trained together, but then maybe they practiced in separate hospitals, patients went to different places.
Jewish doctors were doing very well in Egypt. They had very successful clinics, and in all doctors, of course, there was an Israeli hospital in Cairo and in Alexandria, and all the doctors, most of the, not all of them, but most of the doctors were Jewish there, but they worked all over. They were working in Al-Asr, in our hospital, in other hospitals.
We had in Alexandria, Dr. Sassoon, a very famous pediatric Jewish doctor, very good.
Okay, will you join me in thanking
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.